The night air over the mountains carried a hum that wasn't natural. It came in faint waves, like a tremor rolling across the sky, low and steady enough to rattle nerves but not bones. Every man in the SEAL team knew what it meant. Enemy jets circling above like hawks. Their mission had gone to hell 3 hours ago, when the extraction bird had taken a hit and peeled off, leaving them crouched in the shadows of a jagged valley with no ride home. The radio chatter from command had been clipped, full of static and warnings they already understood. The skies belonged to the enemy tonight. Gunships prowled overhead, drones scanned the ridges, and the sound of jet engines kept any thought of movement pinned down. A dozen SEALs, trained to own the ground beneath their boots, now felt like prey in a hunting preserve. None of them said it aloud, but each man felt the same pressure, the kind that made even the strongest stomach knot. Air superiority didn't just change the game, it erased the board. Lieutenant Jackson Hawk, Mercer pressed his back against a boulder and squinted up at the stars. He couldn't see the fighters, but he could hear them, distant rumbles that teased the edges of the night. His men sat close, weapons ready but eyes restless, every flicker of sound pulling their attention skyward. They had completed the objective, intel gathered, data drives secured, enemy outpost raided, but none of it mattered if they couldn't get out alive. Extraction was supposed to be simple: hike to the ridge, signal the bird, board, and vanish into the night. Instead, enemy aircraft swarmed the airspace, forcing command to scrub the pickup. "Grounded until further notice," was the phrase from ops, and it landed like a hammer. The SEALs weren't used to being grounded. On the ground they dominated. In the sky, under those engines, they were mice under the talons of owls. Mercer checked his watch, then the faces of his men. Ramirez tapped his rifle with impatient fingers. Deke whispered curses under his breath, not at anyone in particular but at the situation itself. Cole, the youngest of the squad, tried to mask his nerves by fiddling with the night scope, though the trembling of his hands gave him away. They were all elite, all hardened, but even the best knew when the balance tilted too far. Enemy dominance in the air was a death sentence for small teams cut off behind the lines. One flyover from a drone, one sweep of thermal imaging, and they would be exposed. Mercer knew they had hours at best, maybe less. His men deserved better than to be hunted like quarry. He exhaled slowly, steadying his nerves. "We hold," he whispered into the dark. "We move when the sky gives us a break." No one argued. They trusted him. But beneath their obedience, fear laced the silence. Minutes stretched into an hour, and the hum of engines never ceased. The enemy jets weren't even bombing, just circling, suffocating the night with their presence. It was psychological warfare, and it was working. The SEALs were trained to wait, to endure, but Mercer saw the strain on their faces. Every second they stayed pinned was a second the enemy could close in. Then the radio crackled, faint but alive. "Valkyrie 1 airborne," came a female voice, crisp, calm, and unfamiliar. The team froze. Mercer raised the handset. "Say again?" The reply came with no hesitation, no doubt. "Valkyrie 1 airborne. Hog inbound. I have eyes on your valley. Sit tight." The voice was steady, carrying an edge of confidence that cut through the night like steel. The men exchanged looks. "A hog?" Mercer's pulse kicked. Only one aircraft in the U.S. arsenal earned that nickname, the A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog. Low, slow, armored, built for one thing: ripping ground targets to shreds. But no one expected to hear that call tonight. The enemy ruled the skies. American air power had been chased back. So who the hell was she? Above the mountains, a new sound entered the night, not the sleek whine of jets but the guttural roar of twin turbofan engines. It was lower, heavier, almost primitive compared to the Predators circling high. The men tilted their heads, straining to hear it. Mercer felt the hairs on his arms rise. That sound carried a promise. The A-10 wasn't fast, wasn't pretty, but it was death incarnate for anyone on the wrong end of its cannon. And now one was inbound, alone. "No way," Deke whispered, shaking his head. "She's flying into a slaughter." Ramirez spat to the side. "Then maybe she's crazier than we are." Cole's eyes lit with something close to hope. Mercer tightened his grip on the radio. "Valkyrie, this is Talon. We copy. What's your play?" The response was calm, almost casual. "My play? I break their grip. You keep your heads down. When I'm done, you'll move." The engines grew louder, steady, approaching. Somewhere in the darkness, enemy fighters were already adjusting, turning to intercept. Everyone knew what should happen. One lone A-10 against supersonic jets was suicide. The Warthog wasn't designed to dogfight. It was a tank buster, a beast of close air support, not an air superiority fighter. But whoever Valkyrie 1 was, she wasn't hesitating. The SEALs could only listen as the sky began to tear itself open. First came the thunder of jets diving to engage, then the defiant roar of the A-10 pushing lower, hugging the terrain, dragging the fight into the valleys where speed counted for less and grit counted for more. A strobe of tracers streaked the horizon, red and green claws raking the dark. Explosions echoed across the ridges. The SEALs ducked instinctively, though the fight was high above. "Jesus," Cole muttered, clutching his rifle. Mercer's jaw locked. The woman in that hog was alone, carrying their survival on her wings. Seconds stretched into eternities. The night became a symphony of violence. Jets screaming, cannon fire rumbling, missiles slicing arcs of fire across the stars. The SEALs couldn't see the whole battle, but they felt it in their bones, in the tremors that shook the ground beneath them. And through it all, the unmistakable growl of the Gu-8 Avenger cannon roared. It was a sound like no other, a metallic bellow that seemed to split the sky. BRRT. The men froze as it echoed across the valley, a savage reminder that the A-10 was no ordinary plane. That cannon didn't whisper. It didn't warn. It devoured. Somewhere in the night, enemy steel was being chewed apart, spit back to earth in flames. Mercer clenched his fists. She wasn't running. She was carving. When the first enemy jet spiraled out of the sky, trailing fire like a comet, the SEALs actually cheered, low, fierce, disbelieving. Ramirez punched Deke's shoulder, grinning in the dark. Cole's eyes were wide with awe. Mercer only exhaled, a ghost of relief seeping through his tension. Against all odds, the tide was shifting. The radio crackled again, calm as ever. "One down. Who's next?" Valkyrie 1 wasn't just fighting, she was taunting, daring the enemy to press her. And they did. More engines screamed, more shadows cut the stars, but the hog danced through it, slow but relentless, armored hide shrugging off what should have ended her. Each pass brought another storm of cannon fire, another eruption of flame in the distance. The SEALs huddled in the valley, listening to the impossible unfold above. For the first time that night, the fear that had gripped them loosened its claws. The enemy did not own the sky anymore. The valley no longer felt like a coffin. The men could still hear the whine of enemy jets, but it was broken, frantic now, not the steady hum of domination. Above the mountains, the roar of Valkyrie 1's A-10 was a reminder that someone, against every law of probability, had turned the sky into a battleground instead of a cage. Mercer crouched low, listening as the air war raged overhead, his instincts split between disbelief and calculation. He couldn't afford to be distracted by awe, his men still needed a way out. But even he couldn't deny what they were hearing. The Avenger cannon had a voice of its own, a feral machine god spitting thunder, and each burst sent tremors across the night. The enemy ruled the air no longer uncontested, and that alone changed the texture of the earth beneath his boots. For the first time since their extraction was scrubbed, Mercer thought escape might still be possible. The radio crackled again, and her voice cut through with the same calm precision as before. "Talon, Valkyrie. They're mad now. Expect heavy passes your way. Stay tight, stay dark." Mercer lifted the handset, answering quickly. "Copy, Valkyrie. We're cold and buried. How long can you keep them busy?" There was a pause, not hesitation but calculation. When she replied, her tone carried steel. "As long as it takes." Simple words, delivered like a promise she fully intended to keep. Mercer stared at the handset a beat longer, letting the weight of that answer sink in. She wasn't bluffing. She wasn't planning an exit. She was going to hold the line alone until the odds bent her way, or until she burned out of the sky. And if she burned, they burned with her. The team understood it too. Their survival was strapped to that hog's wings. Enemy fighters streaked low across the ridge, their afterburners glowing like angry comets. They were hunting for her, trying to drag her into the open sky where speed and numbers would overwhelm her. But Valkyrie 1 wasn't playing their game. Instead, she forced them into hers, skimming canyons, hugging terrain, turning the battle into a knife fight in narrow alleys of rock where her armor and agility worked in her favor. The SEALs heard it all, the whoosh of missiles, the crack of near detonations, the rolling roar of engines chasing engines. Each clash ended with the guttural answer of the Gu-8, and each time the earth seemed to answer with distant fireballs. Ramirez grinned through his grime. "She's flying that thing like it's possessed." Deke muttered back, "Or like she's got nothing to lose." Mercer said nothing, eyes fixed upward, listening. He'd flown with close air support before. He'd trusted gun runs to keep his team alive. But this was different. This wasn't support. This was defiance. The SEALs shifted positions under cover, careful to keep movement minimal. Every soldier in that valley knew the risk of staying too long in one spot. Mercer ordered them to dig in deeper, set a perimeter, and be ready. They weren't spectators, they were still hunted, and the enemy on the ground would be closing in sooner or later. Already, faint pops of gunfire echoed from the ridgelines, distant patrols signaling with rounds into the dark. The enemy wasn't blind to what was happening in the sky. If Valkyrie 1 was forcing their aircraft to fight, their ground units would tighten the noose below. Mercer understood the math. "We're not out yet," he reminded them, voice low, firm. "Stay sharp. If they push, we bleed them here. The hog can't cover us if we fold." The word steadied his men. They were warriors, not spectators, and they needed to feel the fight was theirs too. Above, another scream of engines tore through the night, followed by a violent burst of cannon fire. The Avengers' roar was longer this time, sustained, pouring death into the mountainside. The ground shook with the impact of rounds tearing steel apart. A moment later, a jet's death spiral lit the horizon in orange flame, a comet crashing into the far slope. The men's cheers were sharper now, no longer just disbelief but something like faith. Cole's voice cracked with adrenaline. "That's 3. She's dropping them one by one." Mercer silenced him with a hand gesture, but even he couldn't hide the hard line of a grin tugging at his face. He keyed the handset. "Valkyrie, that's a hell of a show." Her reply came steady, almost casual. "Not a show, Lieutenant. Just keeping the wolves off your neck." Then the channel filled with static as she yanked her hog into another turn, engine howl cutting the night like a saw blade. Mercer found himself picturing her in the cockpit, whoever she was, helmet visor down, eyes locked forward, hands steady on the stick, body pushed against the G-forces that should have broken her already. Flying an A-10 in contested airspace wasn't supposed to be survivable against modern fighters. The Warthog was a beast of the Cold War, designed to shred tanks, not duel with supersonic predators. And yet here she was, doing the impossible with nothing but steel nerves and a 7-barrel cannon. Mercer shook the thought off, forcing himself back to the ground. Admiration was fine, but his team couldn't afford distraction. Still, the image lingered. Whoever Valkyrie 1 was, she had already carved herself into their story, into their survival. If they made it out of this valley alive, it would be because she had bent the sky itself. The night stretched on, battle surging and ebbing like a storm tide. The SEALs could only glimpse fragments, explosions silhouetting ridges, jets clawing through the stars, the hog's unmistakable profile sweeping low, her engines howling defiance. Each time they thought the enemy had her boxed, she broke free, dragging them back down into the canyons. It was a brutal dance, and Mercer knew it couldn't last forever. Armor could only shrug off so much. Ammunition could only hold out so long. Eventually the sky would demand its due. He checked his men again, reading the tension in their faces. They all understood the same truth. Hope had returned, but it was fragile, balanced on the wings of one aircraft and one pilot who refused to yield. Then came a new sound, sharper, closer, the distinctive hiss of incoming artillery. Mortars launched from somewhere up the ridge. The enemy on the ground was making its move. Explosions peppered the valley floor, dirt and stone erupting around the SEALs' position. They dove for cover, instincts honed by years of battle. Shards of rock and steel whined through the air. Mercer barked orders, shifting the team into defensive spread. The enemy wasn't just hunting from the sky anymore, they were tightening the grip from both directions. And then above the chaos came Valkyrie's voice again, sharp, fierce, unflinching. "Talon, mark their tubes. I'll handle the rest." Mercer didn't hesitate. He grabbed the IR marker from his kit, slid from cover and painted the ridge with the invisible beam. Seconds later the night ripped apart. The A-10 dropped in low, her engines howling like a predator diving for the kill. Then came the sound that froze every man in awe, the Avenger cannon unloading in a sustained burst that seemed to last forever. BRRT. The mountain ridge exploded under the hail of depleted uranium rounds, mortar crews shredded before they could reload. The very earth shook, a storm of fire and steel tearing trenches into the hillside. The barrage ceased as quickly as it began, and silence followed, broken only by the groans of collapsing rock. Mercer's men stared, jaws slack. Valkyrie's voice returned, cool as ever. "Mortars neutralized. You're clear to breathe." Cole whispered what all of them were thinking. "She's not human." Mercer keyed the handset, voice low but weighted with truth. "No. She's a damn angel." And in that moment, with the valley shaking and the enemy's grip loosening by the second, every man in the team believed it. The valley stank of smoke and scorched earth. Bits of pulverized stone still rained down from the ridge where Valkyrie's cannon had torn the mortar teams to ash. The SEALs pressed themselves against the dirt, ears ringing, hearts hammering, adrenaline drowning every thought but survival. And yet, in the silence after the barrage, something strange rippled through them, not just relief but awe. In minutes, the pilot they had never seen had reshaped the battlefield, tipping the scales of life and death with nothing but steel and resolve. Mercer lay flat, his cheek against the cold ground, listening to the echo of the Avenger cannon fade. Above, the Hog's engines rumbled as she pulled back up into the fight, a guardian that seemed carved from the night itself. He lifted his head, eyes narrowing. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. If anything, the enemy would only grow more determined. No one gave up air superiority without a price. Sure enough, within minutes, the sky roared back to life. More jets streaked overhead, faster, sharper, their engines clawing at the night with brutal intensity. Mercer could tell by the cadence of their dives, by the guttural rumble that followed, it wasn't just patrol fighters anymore. The enemy had scrambled heavier aircraft, strike craft built to punch holes in armor and obliterate hardened positions. The kind of planes that would feast on an A-10 if they got her cornered. "They're calling in their wolves," Ramirez muttered, low and grim. Cole looked up, his face pale in the dim starlight. "Can she handle that?" No one answered. Deke spat into the dirt, shaking his head. "We're about to find out." Mercer raised the radio, steadying his tone. "Valkyrie Talon. Be advised, new birds inbound, heavier signatures. They're gunning for you." Her reply was a laugh, short, dry, fearless. "Then they'll get what they came for." The next minutes blurred into chaos. The Hog dove low, hugging the valley like a hawk weaving through branches, dragging her pursuers into canyons where their speed became a liability. The SEALs could see flashes now, glowing trails of missiles carving through the night, detonations shaking the ridges. Each time they thought she couldn't possibly evade, she did, her engines growling defiantly as she banked away. The ground quaked beneath each impact. The sky was a storm of fire and fury, and in the center of it all was one stubborn warthog refusing to break. Mercer found himself gripping the dirt until his knuckles ached. She was flying on a razor's edge, threading death like a seamstress stitching chaos into order. And still she fought back. Each dive ended with the thunder of her cannon, each climb with another flash of debris spiraling toward the earth. It was madness and it was working. But the enemy wasn't stupid. Ground fire erupted next, anti-air batteries perched on distant ridges, spitting streams of tracers into the sky. The valley lit up in streaks of orange and red, lines of fire searching for her. The SEALs ducked instinctively, though the rounds weren't meant for them. Mercer cursed under his breath. This was the trap. They wanted to pin her between fighters above and guns below, to box her in until sheer math shredded her apart. He grabbed the radio. "Valkyrie Heavy AA North Ridge. They'll tear you apart if you stay in this box." Her voice came back even sharper now, no trace of hesitation. "Then I'll tear the box apart." The Hog shifted its song, engines roaring lower, heavier, as she pitched into a brutal dive. The SEALs watched as her silhouette cut across the stars, descending straight into the maw of tracer fire. "She's insane," Deke breathed, but Mercer saw something else in the maneuver, not insanity but calculation. She was choosing to break the trap the only way possible, head-on. The cannon's roar split the night like thunder. BRRT. The Avenger spat fire in a stream so long and unrelenting it seemed the earth itself was being sawed open. The North Ridge vanished under torrents of uranium rounds, fireballs blooming as batteries detonated one by one. Secondary explosions chased each other down the slope, sparks blossoming into infernos that consumed everything they touched. The SEALs shielded their eyes, the brilliance turning night into day. When the dust cleared, the ridge was nothing but a skeleton of smoke and ruin. The AA was gone. Valkyrie One's Hog clawed back into the sky, wings shimmering with heat, her engines howling like a wounded beast that refused to fall. The radio crackled, her voice ragged now but steady. "North Ridge clear. Next." Mercer stared at the handset, stunned. Her willpower was iron, but he could hear the strain bleeding through the static. She was pushing her bird to its limits, maybe beyond. Then the ground shook again, not from her but from the enemy. Artillery shells began to pepper the valley floor, blind but relentless. The SEALs scrambled, hugging whatever cover they could find as explosions shredded trees and stone alike. Dirt rained down, choking the air. Ramirez hissed through clenched teeth. "They're zeroing us in. If they can't kill her, they'll crush us." Mercer's mind raced. If they stayed pinned, It was only a matter of time before one of those shells found them. He yanked the handset up. "Valkyrie, we need that artillery gone, or we're done down here." A pause, then her voice harder than before. "Mark it." Mercer didn't hesitate. He and Deke crawled to the edge of cover, lasing the distant flashes of the enemy's guns. His chest hammered as rounds detonated nearby, shrapnel hissing past like angry hornets. Then the Hawk roared again. She came in lower than before, so low the men could hear the rattle of loose panels, the scream of wind clawing at her fuselage. The Avenger opened fire, shredding the artillery line in a storm of molten metal. Each burst triggered a chain of detonations, ammunition cooking off in spectacular eruptions that rolled across the horizon. The shock waves buffeted the SEALs even from a distance, heat licking their faces. The artillery fire ceased, silence descending in its place, broken only by the ragged rumble of the Hog pulling away. The men lay gasping, hearts racing, ears ringing but alive. Ramirez rolled onto his back, laughing breathlessly. "That's it. I'm buying that woman a drink if we live through this." Cole muttered, "If she lives through this." His voice trembled, and for the first time no one hushed him. The truth hung heavy in the smoke. The Hog was still in the fight, but each pass looked like it could be her last. Mercer tightened his jaw, forcing his thoughts into clarity. The enemy wasn't going to stop. They had thrown jets, guns, artillery, and still she endured. That meant the next move would be worse. Maybe rotary wing gunships, maybe reinforcements on the ground, maybe something heavier still. The enemy couldn't afford to lose face, not here, not to one lone bird and a handful of Americans cut off in a valley. His men looked to him for direction, eyes flicking between him and the sky. He gave them what he could, steadiness. "We hold," he said again, the words heavy but unyielding. "She's buying us time. We don't waste it." They nodded, grim, resolute. Time, that was the currency Valkyrie One was bleeding for them. And with every second she held, their odds of extraction, of survival, grew sharper. The night dragged on, each minute a hammer blow of sound and fury. The SEALs fought their own battles, skirmishes with probing enemy patrols, bursts of gunfire exchanged in the dark, blades drawn when the fight came too close. But always, above them, the Hog prowled, her cannon roaring, her engines bellowing, keeping the skies contested. The men fought with a new fire, fed by her defiance. Mercer could feel it in their movements, in the tightness of their grips on their rifles, in the way they looked upward after every burst of cannon fire. She wasn't just covering them anymore. She was part of them, bound by fire and survival, as much a member of the team as any man in the valley. And though no one spoke it, they all knew one truth: if she fell, so did they. The hours stretched into a grinding blur of survival. Smoke and fire painted the valley with ghostly shadows, every ridge lit at intervals by explosions that seemed endless. The SEALs had stopped checking their watches. Time no longer felt like something that could be measured in minutes. It was measured in cannon bursts, in near misses, in the widening ache in their lungs as dust filled the air. Mercer crouched low in the dirt, rifle cradled across his knees, ears straining to catch the rhythm of the battle above. He had expected Valkyrie One to falter long before now. Any sane pilot would have been forced out of the sky after the pounding she'd endured. But still she flew, still her engines clawed through the night, still the Avenger's brutal thunder answered the enemy's every push. It wasn't invincibility, it was willpower, raw and ferocious, holding back the tide by sheer refusal to die. And yet Mercer knew deep down that willpower wasn't armor. Something had to give. That truth came screaming down with the hiss of a missile. The SEALs heard it before they saw it, a vicious streak of fire tearing across the sky. The Hog jinked hard, her silhouette cutting a jagged path against the stars, but the explosion caught her tail. The detonation ripped the night open, a rolling ball of fire that seemed to swallow her whole. For a heartbeat, every man in the valley froze, dread slamming into their chests. Cole's voice cracked into the silence, raw and desperate. "No, no, no, no." But then the Hog punched through the flame, trailing fire, smoke pouring from her left engine, wings rocking under the impact. Her engines screamed like wounded animals, but they still roared. She was hit, damaged, but alive. The radio hissed with static, then her voice cut through, shaky, harsher than before, but still iron. Still flying. Still fighting. Relief crashed through the team like a wave, though it carried with it a sharper fear. She wasn't indestructible. The sky was starting to win. The enemy pressed harder now, sensing blood. More jets dove into the valley, engines howling, missiles slicing arcs of light across the sky. Mercer and his men ducked as shockwaves rolled over them, rocks tumbling from the ridges. Valkyrie 1 fought back with a fury that bordered on madness, dragging her crippled bird through maneuvers that should have torn her wings clean off. The G-8 bellowed in defiance, chewing through anything that crossed her sights. One fighter spiraled down in flames, then another, but each kill came with a cost. Her hog staggered now, movements less precise, smoke trailing like a banner of defiance across the stars. Mercer could almost feel the strain in her voice when it came over the radio. Ammo's running light. Birds bleeding. But I'm not done. Her words were quiet, almost intimate, meant as much for herself as for them. The SEALs exchanged glances, none daring to speak the truth aloud. She was holding the line with the last shreds of her machine, and herself. On the ground, the pressure mounted. Enemy patrols closed in tighter, probing the valley edges with bursts of gunfire. The SEALs engaged in short, brutal skirmishes, each one draining precious ammo and energy. Ramirez dropped 2 men on the ridge with sharp, precise shots, while Deke and Cole cut down a squad trying to flank from the east. Mercer barked orders, shifting his men like chess pieces, using every inch of terrain to their advantage. They were holding but barely, and the knowledge gnawed at him. Without Valkyrie they would be overrun in minutes. Her presence above was more than just firepower, it was a shield, a promise that death would strike harder at their enemy than at them. Every time her cannon roared, his men's resolve hardened. Every time her engines screamed overhead, they remembered they weren't alone. She wasn't just a pilot anymore. She was their anchor in the storm. Then came the moment Mercer had dreaded. The radio crackled, her voice rawer than ever, the edge of exhaustion cutting through. Talon, I've got 1 engine gone. The other's coughing. I can't stay much longer. The words hit harder than any shell. Ramirez slammed his fist into the dirt. She can't go down, not now. Cole shook his head violently as if denial alone could change physics. Mercer gritted his teeth, gripping the handset so tight his knuckles whitened. Valkyrie, you've done enough. You've given us a chance. Get out while you still can. Silence stretched for a beat, filled only by the crackle of static and the distant growl of her dying engine. Then her voice came back, soft but unyielding. Negative, Talon. I don't run while you're still here. You make it out or I don't. The words lodged in Mercer's chest like shrapnel. She wasn't just risking herself anymore, she had already decided her fate was bound to theirs. The enemy must have sensed it too, for they unleashed everything at once. Jets dove in packs, streaking low, while ground forces surged into the valley with renewed ferocity. The air lit up with missiles and tracers, the ground with muzzle flashes and explosions. It was chaos, total and consuming. The SEALs fought like demons, cutting down wave after wave, but for every man they dropped, 2 more seemed to push in. And above it all, Valkyrie 1's hog limped through the maelstrom, bleeding smoke, cannon roaring in savage bursts that shook the heavens. She shredded a squad of infantry about to overrun Ramirez, then wheeled into another pass to rip apart a line of armored trucks cresting the ridge. Each burst seemed to cost her more, the hog staggering, groaning but still flying. Still fighting. Mercer's throat tightened as he watched. She was burning herself out for them, piece by piece, pass by pass. Finally the tide cracked. One of the pursuing fighters strayed too low, chasing her through a canyon, and she baited it straight into her kill zone. The cannon bellowed, tearing the jet apart in midair, its flaming wreckage tumbling into the rocks below. The enemy wavered. The pressure on the ground eased, if only slightly. Mercer seized the moment, rallying his men. Push them back. Now. The SEALs surged from cover, rifles spitting fury, grenades arcing into enemy clusters. They carved space for themselves, a bloody, desperate pocket of breathing room. Above, the hog dragged herself higher, smoke trailing in a long, ragged line. Her voice came over the radio again, cracked, faint but steady. That's your window, Talon. You move now. Don't waste it. Mercer clenched his jaw, heart pounding. She was giving them their chance, and it was clear she might not survive to see it through. The SEALs regrouped quickly, hauling their gear, reloading what little ammo they had left. Sweat and soot streaked their faces, but their eyes burned with the same fire that kept the hog in the sky. They were alive because of her, and they weren't going to squander it. Mercer looked up one last time, watching the silhouette of Valkyrie 1's A-10 carve a defiant arc across the stars, wings shuddering, smoke trailing like a banner of war. He pressed the radio to his lips, voice low but fierce. Valkyrie, you're not alone. We move because of you. Whatever happens, you've already won tonight. There was no reply, only the roar of her engine echoing through the valley, a sound that felt less like a machine and more like a vow. The SEALs began their push toward the extraction point, every step fueled by the knowledge that above them, one woman and one battered hog were still fighting, still refusing to surrender the sky. The sky above the valley trembled with the echoes of artillery, every blast carving scars into the rugged terrain where the SEALs held their precarious ground. Dust and smoke hung like a suffocating curtain, stinging the lungs of anyone who dared to breathe too deeply. Down below, pinned behind shattered stone walls and the wreckage of their own transports, the SEALs were fighting against time itself. They had been ambushed, their supply lines cut, and the enemy's control of the skies meant reinforcements were nothing more than a promise whispered over static-filled radios. Yet in that same sky, weaving through the fire and fury, was the thunderous shape of her A-10, alone, defiant, and relentless. Each pass she made over the valley was a lifeline, every roar of her engines a rallying cry to the men below. The pilot's call sign was Reaper, and the name had become a whispered prayer among the SEALs. They hadn't seen her face, didn't know her real name, but they knew the sound of her Ju-8 cannon unleashing hell. It was the kind of sound that reminded soldiers why they still held the line, why they still gripped their rifles with bloodied fingers even when hope seemed like a distant memory. But Reaper knew something the SEALs didn't. Her fuel gauge was sinking toward empty, and the damage to her left wing was worsening with each maneuver. A thin trail of smoke spiraled behind her as she banked hard to avoid a volley of surface-to-air missiles, the cockpit rattling so violently she thought the bolts holding her canopy in place might shear off. Her jaw tightened as she pulled the stick, forcing the A-10 into another strafing run. She couldn't quit now. Not while the enemy still pressed against the SEALs' perimeter. Not while her presence was the only thing keeping them alive. Down below, Lieutenant Hayes, the SEAL team leader, pressed his back against a fractured wall and adjusted his radio headset, his voice hoarse from shouting over the relentless gunfire. "Reaper, we're nearly out of ammo down here. We've got wounded. If you've got anything left to give us, now's the time." His words cracked with urgency, and though he kept his tone measured, every man around him could hear the unspoken truth: they wouldn't last much longer. Moments later, the valley erupted with the guttural roar of the A-10's cannon, a storm of depleted uranium rounds tearing into enemy armor that had been advancing across the ridgeline. The explosions shook the earth beneath the SEALs' boots, knocking loose chunks of stone and dirt, but none of them flinched. They knew that sound. That was survival. That was hope. And for a moment, despite the chaos, they let themselves believe. Inside the cockpit, sweat poured down Reaper's brow, stinging her eyes as she lined up her next run. Her hands trembled slightly on the controls, not from fear but from exhaustion. She had been in the air far longer than the mission brief had planned, pushing her body and her aircraft beyond reasonable limits. Her oxygen mask rasped with every breath, her muscles ached from the unrelenting strain of maneuver after maneuver, and still the enemy refused to break. She could see the flashes of their anti-air batteries on the ridges, could almost feel the way their gunners had locked onto her silhouette. Her A-10 had been hit more times than she could count, but the beast still held together, rattling and groaning like an old warhorse that refused to fall. She whispered under her breath, half to the aircraft and half to herself, "Just a little longer. Hold with me. Just a little longer." The enemy, frustrated and desperate, shifted their strategy. No longer content to merely hold the high ground, they surged down the slopes in waves, pouring fire into the SEALs' position with a ferocity that made the air scream. Hayes and his men returned fire, but the difference in numbers was overwhelming. "They're pushing us hard," one of his operators shouted, blood streaking across his cheek from a fresh wound. Hayes didn't answer immediately, he couldn't. His eyes darted upward to where Reaper's A-10 had disappeared behind a plume of smoke. Was she still in the fight? Was she even still alive? Then, with a rumble that seemed to tear the heavens apart, she broke back through the haze, swooping low enough that the SEALs could see the torn edges of her wings and the battered fuselage scarred black with burn marks. And still, impossibly, she came back to fight. Reaper lined up her final ordnance, a pair of Maverick missiles she had been saving for when the situation became truly desperate. That time had come. Her targeting system flickered with interference, warning lights blaring across her HUD, but she forced herself to stay calm. Precision mattered. If she missed, the SEALs below would be overrun within minutes. Her breathing slowed, her focus narrowing until the chaos around her faded into silence. The crosshairs locked onto the enemy's armored column pushing through the choke point of the valley. She pressed the trigger. The missile streaked into the sky, a spear of fire and steel, before slamming into the lead vehicle. The explosion tore through the valley, chain reacting through the tightly packed column and engulfing it in a storm of fire. Enemy soldiers scattered in panic, their advance collapsing into chaos as smoke and flames swallowed their momentum. Hayes and his men seized the moment, rallying their remaining strength to push back against the disoriented enemy fighters. For the first time in hours, it felt like the SEALs had the upper hand. Hayes ducked out from cover long enough to see the devastation Reaper had unleashed. "That's it. That's our break. Push them back," he roared to his men, his voice carrying above the gunfire. The SEALs surged forward, every bullet fired now infused with the hope that had been reignited in their chests. Yet even as victory seemed within reach, Hayes' gaze lifted again toward the sky. The A-10 wavered in its flight path, dipping dangerously close to the ridgeline before climbing unsteadily. Something was wrong. Smoke billowed thicker from her left wing, flames licking across the metal like hungry fingers. She had given them everything, more than anyone could have asked, and now it looked like she might not make it back. Hayes felt a pit open in his stomach. She had saved them, but who was going to save her? Inside the cockpit, alarms screamed in Reaper's ears, every system flashing red with warnings she didn't have the time or the strength to process. The controls were sluggish, her visibility cut by smoke that seeped into the canopy. She could barely feel her fingers anymore, her body pushed to the brink of collapse, but her mind clung stubbornly to one last thought: she couldn't crash here. Not in enemy territory. Not where her sacrifice might mean nothing. With her last reserves of strength, she angled the A-10 upward, hoping to climb just enough to reach friendlier skies, or at least to buy herself a few more minutes before gravity claimed her. The SEALs watched from below, every one of them silently willing her battered aircraft to stay airborne. And for a moment, as the A-10 clawed its way upward, defying the flames and the damage, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, Reaper still had one more miracle left in her. The valley had fallen into an eerie silence, broken only by the distant crackle of burning wreckage and the ragged breathing of the SEALs who remained alive. Smoke curled upward in thick, black plumes, blotting out patches of the sky where moments earlier the A-10 had thundered in defiance. Now the beast was limping, trailing fire and smoke as it fought to climb beyond the enemy's reach. Hayes watched with his chest tight, his rifle forgotten at his side. He had seen courage in many forms during his years of service, but nothing compared to the lone pilot who had risked everything to keep them alive. She had done more than hold off the enemy, she had turned the tide. But as her aircraft staggered in the air like a wounded bird, he knew her battle wasn't over. And this time no one could cover her six. Inside the cockpit, Reaper's world was a cacophony of alarms and smoke. Her HUD flickered uselessly, systems cascading into failure one after another. The left wing was nearly gone, control surfaces barely responding, and her fuel had bled out until the gauge glared a flat zero. Every muscle in her body ached, her hands numb on the stick, her throat raw from hours of strained breathing through the oxygen mask. But more than the physical toll, it was the weight of her decision that pressed hardest on her chest: where to put the bird down. She couldn't eject, not here. If she did, she'd fall straight into enemy territory and risk capture. Worse, she'd leave the SEALs vulnerable if the enemy regrouped and struck again. Her only option was to keep flying until she found somewhere, anywhere, to land. The A-10 groaned as she banked away from the valley, flames licking the fuselage like vultures circling their prey. She radioed down, her voice hoarse but steady. "Reaper to ground team. You're clear for now. But I'm hit bad. I don't know how far I'll make it." For a moment, the only reply was static, then Hayes' voice broke through, tight with urgency. "Reaper, listen to me. We've got medevac inbound, but we can't get to you if you go down in enemy lines. You've done enough, more than enough. Find a place and ditch the bird before it takes you with it." His words were harsh, but beneath them was something more: pleading. He didn't want to watch her sacrifice herself after everything she had already given. Reaper's lips pressed into a thin line. She knew he was right. The A-10 was finished, its legendary durability stretched beyond even myth. Every second in the air was borrowed time. But she couldn't just give up, not while she could still see the ridges of Allied territory flickering on her NAV screen. She took a shallow breath, ignoring the smoke clawing at her lungs. "Negative, ground team. I can get closer. I'll bring her as far as I can." She didn't add the truth, that she wasn't sure she'd make it at all. Below, the SEALs moved cautiously through the wreckage-strewn valley, clearing out the last remnants of enemy resistance. Yet every one of them stole glances toward the sky, watching the trail of smoke that marked Reaper's path. She wasn't just a pilot anymore, she was the reason they were still breathing, and none of them could shake the feeling that they owed her more than words. Hayes clenched his jaw as he directed his men. "Move fast. Secure the LZ. If she goes down near here, we'll be ready to pull her out. No one gets left behind." His tone was iron, but the weight in his eyes betrayed the truth. He didn't know if they'd get the chance. The A-10 shuddered violently, a fresh explosion ripping through the left engine and rocking the cockpit. Warning lights screamed across the console, the airframe rattling like it was about to come apart. Reaper gritted her teeth, fighting the instinct to eject, to let gravity take the beast where it wanted. But she had made a promise, not aloud, not even to Hayes, but to herself. She would not let this machine, her machine, fall into enemy hands intact. The Warthog had carried her through countless battles, saved her life more times than she could count. She wouldn't abandon it now. With a final surge of strength, she angled the nose downward toward a barren stretch of scrubland just beyond the valley, her hands steady despite the chaos around her. The impact was violent. The A-10 slammed into the earth with a deafening roar, metal shrieking as it tore across the ground. The canopy cracked, the fuselage crumpled, and fire erupted from the ruined engine. Reaper's head snapped forward against her restraints, the world blurring into a haze of pain and smoke. When the wreck finally skidded to a halt, silence followed, broken only by the crackle of flames consuming the wreckage. For a long moment she didn't move, her body numb and her vision swimming. Then, with a groan of defiance, she forced herself to unbuckle the harness. She wasn't dead. Not yet. Hayes and his team saw the plume of smoke rise from beyond the ridge, their stomachs lurching as the fireball lit the horizon. "That's her," Hayes said, his voice grim. Without hesitation he signaled to his men. "We move now. Double time." Their boots pounded the earth as they sprinted, weapons ready, every muscle straining despite exhaustion. They knew the risk. They were pushing deeper into contested territory, and the enemy could regroup at any moment. But it didn't matter. Reaper had saved them all. Now it was their turn. Reaper crawled from the wreckage, every movement agony. Her leg throbbed with what she knew was a fracture, blood streaked across her forehead, and smoke burned her throat with every ragged gasp. She collapsed against the scorched earth, forcing herself upright only by sheer will. The crash site was silent for now, but she knew it wouldn't stay that way. Enemy patrols would be drawn to the wreck like flies to carrion. She fumbled for her sidearm, her fingers trembling as she checked the magazine. 15 rounds. That was it. She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Guess it's you and me now," she muttered, her eyes flicking back to the ruined A-10 as if it could still hear her. The sound of footsteps in the distance snapped her out of her haze. She raised her pistol, her hand steady despite the weakness coursing through her. Shadows moved through the smoke, drawing closer. For a heartbeat, fear clenched her chest. Was it the enemy? Had they found her already? But then Hayes' voice cut through the haze, firm and familiar. "Reaper. Hold on, we've got you." Relief crashed over her like a wave, her pistol lowering as figures in SEAL gear emerged from the smoke. They rushed to her side, Hayes kneeling beside her, his eyes scanning her injuries with quick precision. "You're tougher than steel, you know." "That?" he said, his voice rough but laced with relief. She let out a shaky laugh, the tension draining from her. "Don't thank me yet," she rasped. "Just get me out of here." The SEALs worked fast, securing her and preparing for extraction even as Hayes called in the medevac. The whine of approaching helicopters soon filled the sky, and for the first time all day hope didn't feel like a distant dream, it felt real. As they lifted her from the wreckage, Reaper glanced back at what was left of her A-10. The beast was gone, consumed by fire and smoke, but its legacy remained written across the valley where it had saved countless lives. She let her head fall back, exhaustion finally pulling her under, but with a small, unshakable truth etched into her heart. She had kept her promise. She hadn't quit. The desert was quieter than it had been in days, but silence on a battlefield never meant peace. It meant something worse was coming. The SEALs knew it. They crouched low behind a battered stone wall on the outskirts of a gutted village, their weapons pointed outward as if the stillness itself might bite. Dust swirled in small, lazy eddies, and every man's heartbeat felt like it thundered too loudly in his chest. They had survived days of hammering enemy fire, ambushes that tested their endurance, and nights of waiting for shadows to creep closer. But now, as the sun set behind jagged ridgelines, the SEALs felt the weight of inevitability pressing down. Somewhere beyond the horizon the enemy regrouped, and when they came they would bring their full force. The only question was whether the Americans would still be standing when the tide arrived. Captain Riley crouched low, eyes flicking across the ridgeline as he whispered into his radio. His men were exhausted, dirty faces, cracked lips, uniforms blackened by soot and blood, but they were holding fast. He didn't mention the toll out loud. Good officers didn't remind their men how close they were to collapse. They reminded them they had more left to give. But even he couldn't ignore the feeling that they were down to their last breaths. He glanced toward the east where the sky faintly glowed, not from the sun but from fires that never seemed to go out. For 3 days they had begged for air support, begged for a reprieve from the steel birds the enemy controlled like gods of war. And then she had come, Lieutenant Sarah Carter in her A-10 Thunderbolt II, tearing through the heavens like vengeance itself. She had shifted the tide every time she appeared, like a shield over men who thought they'd been abandoned. But she was only one pilot, one plane, and Riley knew even legends couldn't fight wars alone. The men still spoke of her in hushed voices, as if she were a ghost summoned when desperation was greatest. One of the SEALs, Corporal Vega, muttered about how he'd seen her A-10 dive so low during the last engagement he thought its wingtips would scrape the rooftops. The cannon fire had thundered like an angry drumbeat, shredding enemy trucks and scattering fighters who moments earlier believed they ruled the sky. But admiration quickly gave way to unease, because word was the enemy had finally committed their ace. A foreign-made strike fighter, fast and lethal, with pilots trained to kill American airframes. It had been held back until now, but reports from intercepted comms were clear. The enemy would unleash it tonight, along with an armored column, to wipe out the SEALs before they could secure the village crossroads. Riley didn't know if Sarah Carter would even make it back in time. And if she did, could her old Warthog outfight a Predator built for the skies? The answer came with a distant rumble. At first the SEALs thought it was thunder, but thunder didn't hum with a mechanical pitch, nor grow steadily louder with each second. They tensed, weapons ready, eyes scanning the horizon until the unmistakable whine of a jet engine split the dusk. A shadow streaked across the fading orange sky, too fast for the eye to follow, and a moment later, a sonic crack rolled through the village like a whip. Enemy jet. Riley's stomach twisted. The battlefield had a new apex predator circling above, and without her, they were prey. The men exchanged grim looks. None of them said it, but they all knew. Their rifles couldn't fight a jet. Their grenades couldn't dent the tanks that followed. They could die hard, but they would still die. Then came a different sound, the guttural roar of twin turbofan engines, low, heavy, and raw. Every man's head snapped up. The A-10. The men leapt from their cover, shouting and pointing as if salvation itself had appeared on the horizon. Sarah Carter's Warthog rolled into view, flying lower than seemed sane, her gray fuselage scarred from weeks of battle yet steady as a rock. The sunlight caught the shark mouth painted on her nose, making it look like the beast was grinning as it came for blood. Over the radio, her voice cut in, calm but edged with iron. "Steel team, I've got you in sight. Hold your ground. You're not alone." Those words, more than the sound of her engines, set the men's hearts ablaze. They crouched back into position, gripping their rifles tighter because they believed again. The duel began before the SEALs could even exhale. The enemy jet screamed down from above, faster than the eye could track, unleashing a streak of cannon fire that tore across rooftops, spraying concrete shards into the air. Sarah yanked her A-10 into a banking turn, the heavy frame groaning as tracers zipped past her canopy. She wasn't supposed to win dogfights. Her aircraft had been built to chew tanks, not dance with fighters. But Sarah Carter wasn't a pilot who listened to limits. She knew her bird, every quirk of its design, every ounce of what it could endure. Where a fighter might have danced with speed, she relied on grit and impossible angles. She dropped low, skimming rooftops so close the SEALs felt the wind of her passage, daring the enemy to follow her into a game of nerves where one mistake meant death. The dogfight unfolded right above their heads, a ballet of fire and thunder. The enemy jet climbed, dove, fired, missed. Sarah rolled, banked, then unleashed her Ju-8 cannon in a thunderous growl that shook the earth itself. The rounds didn't hit the jet, but they raked the ground beneath its path, forcing it to climb harder, higher, away from the cover of the village. Every SEAL craned his neck, caught between awe and terror, because they could feel how thin the line was between triumph and tragedy. And then the tanks arrived. From the northern road, dust clouds heralded the approach of armored steel, a column grinding toward the crossroads with their barrels already aimed. Riley swore under his breath, how much could one woman possibly fight at once? But Sarah's voice cut through again, steady as a heartbeat. Eyes forward, steel. Tanks are mine. Keep your heads down. She dove. Straight down, wings trembling, cannon roaring. The Ju-8's rounds tore into the lead tank, ripping through armor like paper, exploding it into a fireball that lit the village square. She pulled up, skimming through smoke, banking hard to rake another line of armor-piercing fire across the second vehicle. The enemy jet returned, diving to strike her exposed flank, but she rolled just enough, forcing the jet to overshoot, then loosed a pair of Sidewinder missiles in a streak of fire. One missed. The second found its mark. The night sky erupted in a blossom of flame as the enemy fighter spun out, consumed by its own explosion. The SEALs roared like men possessed. Against every law of probability, their angel had struck down a god of war. Still, the battle wasn't done. Tanks burned, the jet was gone, but enemy infantry pressed forward, screaming through smoke and fire. The SEALs fired back with renewed fury, their rifles cracking, grenades booming, the fight collapsing into chaos at every street corner. But they no longer fought as men expecting to die. They fought as brothers shielded by something greater, because above them, Sarah Carter's A-10 prowled the skies like a wolf over its pack. She strafed streets, crushed ambushes, and drew fire onto herself so her men could breathe. And with every pass, she proved the same truth again and again, that the enemy might believe they ruled the skies, but as long as she lived, the sky belonged to her. The battlefield that had once burned with fire and fury was now quiet, save for the occasional thud of distant artillery and the groaning earth beneath armored tracks retreating toward the horizon. The sun was setting, laying down streaks of crimson and gold across the broken ridges, as though the sky itself were painted in tribute to what had just occurred. For the SEALs, still crouched in the shadows of their ruined observation post, the silence felt unnatural, like the breath held in a chest before the sob finally breaks free. They had spent days under the iron grip of enemy dominance in the skies, certain that no American force could break through, certain that their mission would collapse beneath the constant drone of hostile aircraft. Yet here they were, alive, shaken, and staring up at the smoking contrails and drifting ash left in the wake of a single A-10 Thunderbolt II. And at its controls, somewhere above them, was the woman whose courage had rewritten what they believed was possible. Her call signs still buzzed in their radios, her voice calm and steady, the kind of tone that carried soldiers back from the brink. They didn't speak immediately, they only sat in that fragile silence, the enormity of what had happened heavy on their bones. But silence doesn't last on battlefields, and soon the radio crackled alive again. "Ground team, this is Valkyrie. Confirm your position. You're clear for exfil. Repeat, you're clear." It was her, the pilot who had flown into the maw of death and clawed victory out of it with grit, steel, and unrelenting defiance. The team leader pressed the button, his voice rougher than usual, maybe from smoke, maybe from awe. "Valkyrie, this is Trident Actual. We're moving." "Goddamn, ma'am, I don't know what kind of fire you're running on, but you just gave us a second life." There was a short pause, then her voice again, lower now, carrying an exhaustion only fellow warriors would recognize. "Didn't have a choice. No one else was coming." The words carried the weight of truth, of a lone figure deciding to bear a burden others thought impossible. The SEALs moved then, pulling their wounded, securing weapons, checking each other like brothers do, all while glancing up into the bruised sky, half afraid and half hoping they might catch another glimpse of her wings banking overhead. The exfiltration route was a nightmare in itself. Ravines turned to graveyards of twisted steel, ridges littered with burned-out vehicles, villages deserted and echoing with ghostly silence. Yet every time enemy patrols threatened, every time the shadows of drones stretched across the dirt, the A-10 descended again, its engines growling like a beast too stubborn to die, its guns barking with the ferocity of thunder. Each strafing run wasn't just tactical support, it was a reminder that someone had chosen to fight for them, to fly alone where no sane pilot dared, to challenge the sky's tyrants and break them apart. The SEALs' steps quickened not just from adrenaline, but because they could feel themselves wrapped in her defiance, carried forward by the hurricane she had unleashed above them. For every enemy they feared, she was there, her jet's shadow sweeping over them like a guardian's hand. The myth of enemy dominance had been shattered. The sound of her G8 cannon was now the sound of salvation. As they reached the extraction point, a battered ridge with a landing zone barely wide enough for a bird, the sky above had darkened fully. The last light caught the lines of the A-10 circling high, one wing dipping slightly as though in acknowledgement. The SEALs looked up, and though no words passed between them, the same thought stirred in all their hearts, that they had witnessed something rare, something that went beyond mere tactics or missions. This was the kind of act that soldiers told around campfires, that carved itself into the marrow of a unit's memory. And they knew even then that long after the war's maps were redrawn, long after medals were pinned and forgotten in dusty drawers, her flight through that contested sky would remain alive in their stories. They would tell it not as legend but as truth because they had lived it. They had survived because one pilot decided not to bow to the impossible. The exfil bird thundered low, rotors chopping the night, kicking up dirt and ash in violent spirals. The SEALs rushed aboard, dragging their wounded, weapons clanging against metal. Over the roar, the team leader keyed the mic one last time. "Valkyrie, this is Trident. We're aboard. If you ever need a team on the ground, you call us. Doesn't matter where, doesn't matter when." There was static, then her reply, soft but firm, "Copy that, Trident. Fly safe. I'll keep the skies open for you." And with that, the channel went quiet, but the silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was full, like the pause after a prayer answered. The bird lifted, and the SEALs stared through the open door at the shrinking figure of the A-10, its twin tails glinting faintly in the starlight. Alone, it wheeled across the sky like a predator, still hungry, still watchful. They didn't see her face, didn't know her real name, and maybe that made it better. To them, she was something larger than life, the embodiment of resilience, the living proof that even in the darkest night, one person's will could burn brighter than all the fire raining down. Later, long after the mission debriefs and after-action reports, the brass would speak in clipped tones about the unconventional sortie, and air support exceeding operational expectations. But the SEALs knew better. Reports could strip away the soul of what happened, reduce it to coordinates and ordnance counts. For them, it wasn't about numbers, it was about the sound of her voice cutting through static when they thought they were already dead, about the howl of her gun tearing open the sky, about the way she made them believe again. And belief in war was more dangerous than any weapon. When the helicopter finally crossed the safe line, the men sat back, some closing their eyes, others gripping their rifles as though letting go would break the spell. No one spoke for a while. They didn't need to. Each of them was replaying the same reel in his head. The dive of her jet through fire, the impossible maneuvers, the unflinching defiance. And though the war would drag on, though battles still loomed and missions awaited, they carried with them a memory like armor. Whenever fear clawed at them, whenever orders felt like death sentences, they would remember the day the enemy ruled the skies, and how she, alone against all odds, tore that rule to pieces. And so, as the horizon finally swallowed the battlefield behind them, the story was sealed. The SEALs had believed the sky belonged to the enemy. But now they knew better. The sky could still be broken, still be reclaimed, if just one pilot had the courage to fly through it. And forever after, when they told the tale in bars, in barracks, in the quiet spaces between wars, they would lean forward, their voices hushed but proud, and say, "The SEALs believed the enemy ruled the skies, until her A-10 broke through alone." The end.